Hallo und herzlich willkommen bei Inside IONOS. Ich bin Andreas Maurer. Das Internet ist, wenn man seinen Vorläufer ARPANET mitrechnet, mehr als 50 Jahre alt. Heute ist das Netz nicht mehr aus unserem Alltag wegzudenken. Mit dem Smartphone trägt jeder seinen eigenen Internetzugang in der Tasche und dank Social Media sind wir alle zu Content-Produzenten geworden. Aber Zensurbestrebungen, Überwachung und die Gefahr von Datenmissbrauch bedrohen in vielen Teilen der Welt die Grundprinzipien von Offenheit und Freiheit, die das Internet geprägt haben. Nicole Scott, eine kanadische Journalistin, die seit einigen Jahren in Berlin lebt, hat sich jetzt mit diesem Thema in einer Videodokumentation auseinandergesetzt. Welcome to Inside IONOS, Nicole.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, what did make you do this documentary in the first place about openness and freedom of the internet?
Well, it was really interesting. I actually started to talk with Annabelle from IONOS, and we kind of got brainstorming. Like, we were really thinking about the different ideas about what's going to be happening in the future. It was kind of over dinner, and we realized that there's a discussion coming up, and it's going to be important in the future to discuss the ideas of digital democracy, the fact that our internet is having borders. You know, what does this mean for the everyday person? Like, how are we going to trust in the future, right? And website ownership and domain validation was one of the central ideas that we kind of kept coming back to, and like what this means in the future and how we're going to have information. And so then we just kind of got excited about it, and that's kind of how it was born.
Was there any specific element that made you move in this direction? Anything where you say freedom of the internet is actually endangered?
Well, I think that if we all watch the news and the state of the media, we can all tell that our digital freedoms are in danger. I mean, with AI in the last year, everything is becoming more uncertain, and the ability for the everyday person to fact check and understand what is real and what isn't is something that is more and more present every day. So as we move forward and we think about digital freedom, you know, like, what does this even mean anymore? Because the idea that freedom to say anything that you want online, as in freedom of speech, actually isn't the right conversation. And this is something that everyone kind of plays out over and over and over, right? And we kind of came to the point where it's also cultural, like what is okay to say out loud. And it's not even about democratic versus non-democratic. It's about how online we're going to come to a consensus. And like, we had the discussion of net neutrality a few years ago, and it's kind of evolved into content governance online. And it's like the whole scenario of what the internet is changing. And I think even as technology experts, you know, I was hard pressed to say, this is how the internet works, right? And when we really got down to it, the internet's infrastructure was this layer that is a physical thing and is hyper-controlling the way the content looks and is viewed and feels online. And the physical infrastructure of the internet is definitely one of those things that even technology experts today might be hard-pressed to say this is exactly how it works in 2024. And that was a layer that I thought was really interesting, because the physical layer of the internet is real, it's tangible, it's wires and cables and servers, and everyone tends to think of the internet as an abstract concept, when actually it's service providers like IONOS dealing in physical hardware that are powering the internet, right? And how does this layer work with the ideas of content in the future? And I found that really interesting, because no one's really looked at that physical, tangible thing, because I like to be reminded that it's not an abstract concept, the internet. Like, even though all the debates around the internet are philosophical, right? The internet is a physical thing governed by physical rules, right? And that to me kind of provided comfort.
Before we dive a little bit deeper into many of the topics you've mentioned already, of course, you didn't do this on your own, but you talked to many experts. I think I counted 17 or 18 different people that you've interviewed. How did you come to choose these experts?
Well, when you're looking at the topic of what's going to be happening in the future online as it relates to physical infrastructure, the list started to kind of make itself, right? I didn't want to talk to, you know, the same thought leaders that everyone's been speaking to for the past decade about what's going to be happening. I wanted to talk to people that are shaping the rules and guidelines today, right? So ICANN, and then this led to the IETF, which I had never heard about. And they also provided different names of people that they thought I should be speaking to. After I said, no, I don't want to talk to the big names of the internet, the founders. I want to speak to people who are working and shaping today. And this is how I added Lily Ray, who's like one of the most influential SEO experts. And this is how I added Monty from MariaDB, who's also a legacy influencer, but also shaping the way databases are moving forward. Then there's Martin from SAP, who's a futurist, who's, using their very large and impactful technology, about shaping the way that businesses are going to be evolving, right? So it's these people who have a hand in shaping the future of the internet.
You covered really a lot of different aspects. And one thing you've mentioned several times already is the physical infrastructure, the wires that make the internet. If you think about freedom and openness, that's probably not the first thing that comes to mind. So maybe you can talk about how does this physical infrastructure actually relate on this aspect of freedom and democracy in the internet?
The reason why you have to deal with the physical is because of the DNS. And this is where it becomes really interesting because domain name server just seems so nerdy and so random as a central topic. But it's because it's become political.
Maybe we should just explain roughly what DNS is for people who haven't heard the term. It's the domain name service, and it's basically something like the phone book of the internet, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in the content series, I actually play a librarian for a scene because the librarian kind of acts as the DNS. It knows where all the books are. I go to find the books and I bring the books back, right? So this is like I'm fetching content on the internet, right? And I think what people actually kind of miss is that a website's content sits on a single server in a single location. Yes, there are ways that content is multiplied online, but in general, the content sits in one place. So the DNS will take you to that place, and then it will bring the content back to you. And so what's happening is because of the physicality of the DNS's location, right? It's a specific place. Governments can say, you know what, let's just block that DNS. We'll just stop people from going there. We'll say that they cannot visit this physical location, right? But the problem is, just because someone can't visit it doesn't mean that it's not still physically there. I mean, the content is still sitting there on the server in Germany and Switzerland and somewhere, right? It's just you can't get to it because you don't know the phone number or you don't know the location. And so to me, it's a lazy way of moderating content because you can make requests to take down content. And this is actually something that a lot of governments avoid because it's a little bit sloppy. But then they say, well, let's just choose the DNS, right? So then they're actually messing around with the physical infrastructure of the internet, right? Like how the information travels from a physical server to your smartphone. And so for me, this kind of became interesting because if we're looking at how the internet is going to be free in the future, we need to know how we're going to be moderating our content, what content governance looks like online. And the physicality of the internet plays a big part in that.
The most famous or infamous example probably is the so-called Great Firewall of China, where the Chinese government basically has taken control of the entire DNS infrastructure. But on the other hand, China is not the only country. I mean, we have similar discussions over here in Europe and even in Germany. I can remember the first discussions about access blocking in 2006 or 2007, so more than 15 years ago when we discussed this for dealing with child pornography. But we also had the same discussion, for instance, in Germany about gambling sites that are illegal in some German states. So it's probably not only something that happens in the communist part of the world.
Well, I think that's exactly it. Like we're kind of under the illusion that because we live in a democratic country that we have an open and free internet. But the truth is that even though we have democracy, doesn't guarantee freedom online. And I think that this is one of the central ideas that I try to get across, and why I talk about China and its Great Firewall is because, like, in China, people know that the content is blocked. People know that they're being monitored, and they are actually more digitally savvy because of it. I feel like maybe we have a complacency in democratic states because we believe our internet is online, so we're not as on guard about maintaining its freedom, because we kind of believe that democracy in our country state will mean democracy online. And this actually isn't true. We have to look at how we're developing rules for the internet, because there isn't global guidelines. I mean, there's technical guidelines, but there's not global content guidelines. It's all country by country.
It's definitely a challenge for a globally operating company like IONOS, because of course we have to adhere to many different laws, like all the ISPs have to, etc., and all the big companies. And that's really a challenge because as you said, there's not just this one law governing the internet, but there are a lot of different regulations in different countries. And as a company working in this area, it's very hard to comply with all the rules across the world.
And this is absolutely true. And it's one of those things where ISPs globally aren't all trustworthy. You know what I mean? There are states where you have to pay attention and know which laws your ISP is adhering to. And there's actually one topic that I do touch on, which is internet throttling. And I found this kind of interesting because it's a legal way of controlling the internet, right? And there's business cases around it, no?
I think it depends on where you are. If it's legal, I think that's basically net neutrality. We mentioned this term in the beginning that we're talking about. And the idea of net neutrality is basically every bit is equal. And for instance, in Europe, for a couple of years, we have actually a regulation that enforces net neutrality. So I think it also depends on in which jurisdiction you are, what you can do. And for instance, here in Germany, we had some big court cases where some services from ISPs were shut down because they didn't comply with net neutrality.
Yeah, and there was that big one in the US where I actually can't remember which telco bought Hulu and then tried to divert all of their traffic to Hulu and like throttled Netflix to make people trying to switch service providers. Right? So like there is a business case behind how throttling happens in democratic countries, right? It's not just the way it happens in China where, instead of blocking a website, it's just throttled. So you're actually not sure if it's just your internet where the page isn't loading or if it's actually being blocked. Right. So the same technology is used legally in a lot of countries, but then can be used by oppressive states to control content. Right. So it's also this way of like us in our democratic countries being aware that this could be a way that governments could control the free flow access of content by not actually blocking it, but just making it slower or harder to access.
But again, you're talking about democratic countries, but not all the democratic countries have the same rules. I'm just thinking about a different topic. You covered the area of social networks who have become really huge powers in terms of public opinion. So they definitely also should watch closely what they're doing. But on the other hand, again, if you talk about things like hate speech, generally, how do social networks deal with civil liberties, with privacy, and especially with freedom of speech? The rules are very different from country to country. For instance, both in the US and in Germany, freedom of speech in different terms is in the Constitution, but it has a very different standing in the US than it has over here.
Totally.
And I think that also makes it very difficult.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere in the world has as great a liberty to say whatever you want as in America. I mean, this it just doesn't fly in a lot of other countries. So one of the ideas that I bring up in the series is the fact that in Germany, because the rules around what you can say are actually pretty strong. And this kind of creates a nicer narrative than what can happen in, say, America, where you're just allowed to say whatever you want. But then it kind of became interesting when I looked at this video game, Wolfenstein 2, that came out a few years ago. And they actually replaced the Nazi symbolism with a different symbol, right? Because in video games specifically, you couldn't show that inside of Germany. I mean, they loosened the laws for video games, but then it was, illegal in Germany, but legal everywhere else, right? And so because of Germany's history, its cultural background, it makes sense. But it also makes sense to lighten the rules in video games, right? So like Germany changed the law to, move on with modern time. So it's just an example of how cultural relativity, really impacts the content that we're going to see in each country. And I don't think it's going to get any easier as we move forward because countries are putting up more borders around their content and creating kind of boundaries online. And this is a reality, but it also feels like a new thing that is going to be a discussion over the next few years. And it's really just kind of gaining momentum now.
So we said we don't have a global internet government, but on the other hand, we have something like that. You mentioned two bodies that exist. One is the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and the other one is ICANN, if I get it correctly, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Yeah, I haven't heard this for a while.
Oh man, what a long name. It's so awkward too.
So what are the purposes of these organizations and how are they set up in this global context?
So it actually took me a little while to really get my head around what ICANN did. So the Assigned Names and Numbers, so it's website addresses, IP addresses, so like the numbers that you just kind of put together with dots, and then they control all the domain names. And I thought, oh, why is this a big deal? .com, .de, .ru, .biz, .name, .tv. I mean, like we have so many, right? Like, what power can this really have, right? And then I realized actually a lot. Right. So ICANN used to be an American focused body, and then they actually became international because they couldn't, so much power couldn't be consolidated with one country. And so now it's a multi-stakeholder approach. So all of these companies, Ionos included, right, have a voice for what happens with these domain identifiers. Now, what could go wrong? Right? Well, actually, a lot. So at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Ukraine tried to kick Russia off the internet, to take their .ru domain off the internet. And now if ICANN had said yes, no one would be able to visit a .ru website. And this is huge, right? And so if Russia, for example, were to take control of its domain name, instead of it sitting with ICANN, right, a neutral governing body, Russia could potentially, should they choose to, if they got control of their domain name, then every website within that domain would not be trustworthy, because you could decide that this newspaper where all the Russians are getting their news suddenly is now a government front, but it still has the name that everyone trusts, and it's just redirected. So they could actually redirect any website within the .ru to make it whatever they want, to show any kind of information. And then this is bad for freedom and openness. And so that's why ICANN is so important. And so I started talking to ICANN, and then everyone just kept on saying IETF, IETF. And I was like, what is this task force? And I really liked it, task force. It really felt action oriented. But they're actually the ones who are controlling the technical specifications of the internet. The best example is like when the internet changed from sequential loading. So when you have a website, the page kind of loads from top to bottom, and then we went to dynamic. And this happened because we got voice calling, and it actually mattered the order of the packets, right? Because we couldn't have our video and voice coming in whatever order was easiest for the internet to send it, right? And so that's how we kind of got video calling online as a standard through all browsers. That's how we got responsive dynamic websites. It was through changes in standards. But what's even weirder is that ICANN, you have to follow the rules, and they come to a consensus. IETF, it's just guidelines. Someone could decide whatever they want.
I think that's not an aspect you covered in your documentary, but that's really interesting because the main standards of the internet, at least, are called RFCs, requests for comments. So, and that's how it all started with still at the time of the ARPANET, the predecessor of the internet, which was funded by the US Department of Defense, where they started really sending out a request for comments to a proposed standard. And all the engineers just finally agreed on what's best for the system. And much of how the internet works today is still based on these RFCs. So it's actually quite interesting how these two systems work besides each other.
Yeah, that it's this multi-stakeholder approach that everyone kind of has a voice, you know. And what's kind of interesting is with the task force is that, like, I do talk about Google Chrome, right? And how Chrome could just decide that they want to change the security certificate timelines, right? Like right now they're every year, but Google wants to move them to every 3 months. And basically, if they did that, they would be forcing an internet standard, right? And everyone's kind of saying like, is it really Google's job to decide the security for all websites online? But then in the same breath, is it so bad that websites are secured every 3 months because it gives, bad actors less time to hack in? Like, it's not a bad suggestion. It's just, do we want Google having that much control?
Yes, it's probably just their market power. Another aspect where also Google plays a role was just how browsers used to work. At least I don't know if it's still the same, but like 10 years ago, you definitely had to write different code in HTML for Internet Explorer, for Chrome, for Mozilla Firefox, because of course there were standards for HTML, but then still every company used their own flavor of it, and which didn't always interact with each other.
Absolutely. I can still remember being like, oh, this website doesn't work on Netscape. I wonder which browser they programmed it for. So then you're entering it into different browsers to try to figure out how you can view it properly.
And also talking about Google, who are behind Chrome, of course, Google is the world's largest search engine. And this also plays an important role for freedom of the internet, right?
Yeah, this is why I spoke to Lily Ray, because honestly, this SEO topic is just so interesting because honestly, as a previous website owner, I would always think, oh, this is, snake oil, like SEOs are just kind of making up the rules as they go along. But then it's impacting businesses, right? Like your search visibility online will impact your livelihood, right? So like it isn't a joke. You can't not take them seriously, but they are just kind of like guessing at what Google is choosing to do with their algorithms. And there are other search engines out there. It's just Google's the biggest. So they're kind of dominating the market and deciding who has a stronger livelihood online, right? Like even if you're a chiropractor who actually doesn't need the internet, your visibility as a chiropractor to gain new business will come from online. So like increasingly the way that we work and live is tied to our digital presence online, whether we like it or not. Right. And that's what's a bit scary about Google's control.
So we talked about the hardware infrastructure of the internet, but of course, at least half of the internet is also software. And basically, most of the internet is based on open source software. I mean, if you think about the web server Apache and its successors, open source databases like MySQL, MariaDB as its successor, how important has open source been for the advancement of the internet, and what are current developments in this area?
For me, open source is incredibly important because we need a system that is verifiable, checkable, and open. And we need something that can be worked on by multiple people, right? And so one of the things that I discovered over the course of this series is that people actually aren't really interested in talking about open source that much anymore. They just believe it's a base that lives there. And, like everyone's just kind of, it's there, right? It's not changing. That might not be true, but that's kind of the attitude, right? And everyone's now kind of focused on open standards, the interoperability, how things work together. But the conundrum of that is that just because something has an open standard doesn't mean that it's not a part of a closed system, right? So like large corporations can have closed systems, but an open standard that works with them. And that's actually not the spirit of open source technology at all, right? And so I found that kind of disheartening that the overall industry narrative has moved from a genuine community of open source to a little bit more of a focus on open standard.
So it's interesting that you still have some people who really enforce this idea of open source, like Monty Videnius that you talked to at the IONOS Summit, who invented MySQL. Then his company got sold to Oracle, who tried to make a business out of it. And just as a reaction, he invented the next system, free software MariaDB, which he put in the foundation to make sure that it stays open and free.
And I think that this is the important work that definitely needs to happen, because without this kind of openness, this platform of true interoperability, we won't actually be able to build anything meaningful. And this is kind of the thing that I'm worried about going away, because like I do a lot of work in automotive, right? And I talk to a lot of executives there, and they actually can't wrap their head around the fact that it's open and free, but yet there's a business model around it. And I was like, seriously, guys, it's been around for like 50 years. How is this still a question right now? Right. And I think that's actually one of the challenges of it still. And I think that is actually quite crazy.
Another big topic, of course, that currently everybody's talking every day, every hour with some news coming up is AI, artificial intelligence. And you also briefly covered this in one segment. What do you think? In what way does AI influence the state of the internet in terms of openness and freedom?
I think that we're going to have a digital divide later with people who don't understand how AI works. I mean, we're 1 year in, or over 1 year in now. And I think we're already starting to see a divide between people who use AI and people who don't, right? Because it's about optimizing the way that you work and supercharging your workflow. Like, that's how I see it. As a journalist, I am the most at risk from AI, but I'm not worried at all, actually. But it's because, like, for me, it will be a divide between journalists who know how to use AI properly and journalists who don't. So for a lot of industries, I think it's going to be the same thing, right? And if you're not increasing your digital literacy to understand what AI is, how it works, what blockchain is, how that works, why this is important in the way the future of our society is going to look, right? If you're not understanding these concepts, then you're in danger of being left behind. And this is more the point that I'm making, not that we should be afraid of technology, but we should be afraid of our reluctance to engage with technology meaningfully. If we all just think that it's, we're online all the time and we're just consuming on Instagram and scrolling and, we're only putting things out there in a way that we think the algorithm will like, or we think that our network will like, then we're not meaningfully contributing, right? So like it's genuinely about understanding how the technology works and how we can use it best. And that's challenging for society at whole in general.
Definitely. And we've just done a survey a couple of months ago in the US and in some big European countries, Germany, Spain, France, and the UK. And generally, there is some awareness, but it's quite different from country to country. And what I found very interesting, that actually the UK was the most critical towards AI, whereas Germany, the US, and surprisingly for me, Spain were very open-minded. But of course, still with a lot to learn. But I'm really curious if we do the same survey again, maybe in a year, how this result will look and how business develop. I mean, you mentioned journalism, but it will affect basically every business that you can think of.
Absolutely. I mean, AI is going to impact everyone, and it's more a matter of understanding how you can use it to your advantage. How can it teach you to do new things? How can you leverage it to get more out of what you're doing? How can you look at the job that you have now and optimize whatever it is using AI, right? It's about recognizing that it's a tool that you can use and not, this omnipotent being that's going to be, sentient and take over your your role. Because I think it's really just about like now as the technology is developing, it's about how we use it. And I think that as a society, this is such a powerful tool that we're having trouble imagining how it can be used to our advantage, right? And this is one of the first times in a long time where our creative mind is like, well, how can we use this? I mean, the possibilities are limitless. And then when things are limitless, how do you decide, right? So this is kind of the state that I think society is in. And I think that that's genuinely exciting.
Finally, another technology that you mentioned that I actually didn't have on my radar at all is something called Web 5. I mean, I know Web 1 was the classic web, Web 2 was the social web, Web 3 started with blockchain, but what does Web 5 stand for and how can that improve freedom, liberty, openness of the internet?
So Web 5 is actually Web 2 plus Web 3, right? Because you kind of think, well, we're at Web 5, what happened to Web 4? But it's actually Web 3, which involved blockchain, this hopeful idea of returning to the original concept of the internet, where everyone kind of has autonomy over their data, where everyone kind of has ownership of who they are online and their digital presence, all kind of validated by blockchain. Combined with Web 2, which is what we have now, where we gave away all of our convenience. We gave away all of our data because we wanted things to be convenient. Right. So it's this combination of Web 2 plus Web 3 equals Web 5. I love the idea, but we're at the start. I mean, like most people haven't heard of it, of course, because it's almost novel. I was worried. I was worried it was going to be a buzzword, but genuinely, I think the idea is solid. So I pick away at the gaps, but it's an interesting concept to watch.
I think one important aspect of it is also decentralization, if I understood it correctly. And of course, on the one hand, you have stuff like blockchain, but I wonder if services like the Fediverse also fit into this concept. In Europe, Mastodon is a big thing, and just the latest big thing in terms of social media platforms was, of course, Threads, the new platform from Meta. And they've announced that they will open it up to the Fediverse, to the ActivityPub protocol. So even some of the big players are moving in this direction.
Absolutely. I mean, we have to change the way the internet is now because it is broken, right? Like as it evolved, we didn't expect it to be the thing that it became. And we don't have individual autonomy over our data. And this is important because the governments and the tech companies haven't been working together in a harmonious way. Tech companies are too fast, governments are too slow, and the internet kind of gets caught in the middle, like not being the thing that the population actually needs. So I think you are right. This concept of decentralization, ownership of identity, and convenience, right, are going to be coming together inside of Web5. And we're starting to see these concepts evolve now.
Governments are slow, but nevertheless, in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a lot of new regulations, especially over here in the EU. Just thinking about the Data Act, Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, the NIS2 initiative. Just very recently, what's done in the discussion is the AI Act. So how do you view these legal procedures, these new laws?
They're necessary. And sometimes they feel a little bit too little too late. I mean, but the AI Act for Europe, a continent that I feel moves very slowly, looks good, right? But where I think that a lot of these acts need bolstering is the involvement of the tech companies. I think that no side can do it by itself, and we need them to come together and to be a lot more interactive. And so I feel like the way that lobbying happens for regulation, the way that tech companies are half a step ahead of everyone all the time in, taking advantage of the consumer most of the time. Right. And so this is kind of the thing where we actually need the tech companies to get on board and start to lead. Whereas right now they're only leading for their profits and shareholders. And the concept of how tech companies work and how governments have, personal freedoms and the way that society should be evolving at their heart, hopefully, in an idealistic world, we need these things to kind of come together. And that's the piece that I feel is starting to happen, but really needs to happen a lot faster and more meaningfully.
You started the work on this project, obviously, with quite a skeptical point of view, otherwise you wouldn't have done it. Now you've talked to a lot of experts, you've dived really deep into this topic. How optimistic or pessimistic are you after all this work?
I have to admit 50-50. Part of me is really excited about the potential of the internet, how things are going to be evolving in a more meaningful way for people. Like the potential of AI to impact people's lives, to teach us things, to guide us, right? The power of all of these things that used to be too difficult are now easily at our fingertips. Like the human potential that can be unleashed with AI and how the internet's evolving is so exciting, but we have to choose. People have to choose not to be addicted to scrolling. People have to choose that instead of scrolling, they're going to learn and engage with what we have in a different way. And this is the part that I still struggled with towards the end. I mean, how do we get people out of their phone addiction, right? And I asked so many people, and no one really gave me an answer that I was super happy with. And so this is the part where I am a little bit skeptical, because you can present somebody with a perfect thing, but they have to choose to accept it. But I guess that's the most beautiful thing, is that we are human and we do have choice. So that in itself always gives me hope.
So I hope that many people will actually watch the documentary. We will put all the links in our show notes. And with that, I say thank you very much, Nicole, for taking the time. And maybe we meet again in a year to see how the freedom of the internet has developed.
Absolutely. I mean, hopefully for the good.
Nicoles Videodokumentation Digital Democracy finden Sie unter www.youtube.com/@digitaldemocracy the series. Das alles zusammengeschrieben. Und den Link packen wir natürlich auch in die Shownotes. Wie immer freuen wir uns über Kommentare zu dieser Folge, entweder direkt unter der Episode oder per Mail an podcast@ionos.com. Und genauso freuen wir uns natürlich über eine Bewertung auf Apple Podcasts oder der Podcast-Plattform Ihrer Wahl. Und wenn Sie zum ersten Mal dabei sind, können Sie Inside Ionos natürlich auf allen gängigen Podcast-Plattformen abonnieren. Danke fürs Zuhören und bis zum nächsten Mal.